Hello and welcome to Independent Thinking, the weekly podcast from Chatham House. I'm Bronwen Maddox. I'm back on the podcast after a week in Israel and East Jerusalem, meeting both Israeli and Palestinian officials, diplomats, members of civil society, up on the Lebanon border, down on the Gaza border. And I was on that trip at the Lebanese border just the day before Hezbollah's communications network was hit by Israel in those attacks. First pagers, then walkie-talkies. Those attacks have seemed to signal a new phase in the violence between Israel and Hezbollah that has intensified since Hamas's attacks of October 7th and Israel's military offensive in Gaza that followed. This week, we've seen Israel's most aggressive campaign against Hezbollah since the 2006 Lebanon war. We've seen Israeli strikes on Beirut and on the south of Lebanon, which have killed hundreds of people at the time that we're speaking, tens of thousands more trying to flee to safety. Hezbollah, in turn, has fired hundreds of rockets into northern Israel, from where around 60,000 people had been already evacuated from their homes. So today we're talking about what Israel is trying to achieve with these latest actions, why it's striking at Hezbollah now, and whether the Israeli government has any realistic prospect of what you might call success. We'll also look at the likely response of Hezbollah, a much more powerful force than Hamas, and indeed what Iran, its backer, might intend as well. Of course, all this is intimately connected to the war in Gaza, with Hezbollah promising to continue its attacks on Israel until there is a ceasefire there. Next week is the anniversary of the October 7th attacks. It is a chance to consider all that's happened since and, crucially, what lies ahead for Israel and Palestine. And we will record another podcast episode next week looking more closely at those questions. But today, as I said, our focus is on Hezbollah and Israel. And I have to discuss this a terrific set of guests. Returning to the podcast is Lina, Khatib, Associate Fellow with our MENA programme, former head of that programme. Welcome.
Thank you.
Great to have you here. Also joining me from Dubai is Gregg Carlstrom, the Middle East correspondent for The Economist. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Great to have you. And here in the studio with me as well is Yossi Mekelberg, an Associate Fellow with the programme, the Middle East and North Africa programme, and who was with me for much of the trip last week. Welcome.
Nice to see you again.
Yeah, it has not been long. I was trying, as I said, to get from Israel to the Liverpool for the Labour Party conference, but all flights out were difficult. Let's plunge into this first question of why Israel has chosen to strike Lebanon now. And let's start with some of the very basics. Gregg, I wonder if you could set out for us what Hezbollah is and why Israel has chosen to strike them now.
Hezbollah is a Shia militia and political party. It is the strongest armed force in Lebanon. It emerged in the 1980s during the Israeli occupation of South Lebanon, which continued until 2000. And so in its early years, Hezbollah was a group that fought against that Israeli occupation. More recently, of course, it played a pivotal role in defending Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria during the uprising against him in the 2010s. And it remains to this day, again, the strongest actor in Lebanon. It also operates a network of educational, charitable, economic institutions. It runs an economic empire in Lebanon. It has seats in the parliament. It often has ministers in the cabinet. So not just a military actor in Lebanon, but also a political and social force as well, and an actor that has been firing rockets at Israel for almost a year now, that began fighting Israel on October the 8th in solidarity with Palestinians in Gaza, and has continued that fight to this day.
Yossi, perhaps you can pick up from there. Why has Israel chosen to do this now? We saw quite a bit on the northern border of these evacuated towns, didn't we?
Yeah, first of all, most of the north is empty, evacuated. There are 60,000 displaced Israelis. And you see in the city of Kiryat Shmona, 2,000 out of 24,000. The rest are in hotels across the country. And the message, I think, was so clear. It's unsustainable. And we heard also that some of the military personnel would say this is a strategic achievement for Hezbollah. They can keep some of the country without its citizens, and for nearly a year now. And I think the message was very clear. Can't go for much longer.
When you say, or when they say, you quote them accurately saying, this cannot go on, where is the sense of urgency coming from?
So it's interesting, at the beginning of the war, people like the defense minister, Yoav Gallant, thought that the north was more important than the south, that Hamas, it's easier to manage, and maybe it's not worth actually to spend all this, not only the military force, but also the cost, the diplomatic cost, on the south and on Gaza. He wanted at the time to go actually and use this opportunity the minute that Hezbollah joined the war, and to hit the Hezbollah as hard as possible, because for the last 10, probably 15 years, Hezbollah is seen as the major threat, because what it is, and because what it represents in terms of its association with Iran.
Okay, but I'm pushing you on this question of why now? Because, yes, we're coming up to the anniversary of October 7th. Yes, these people are displaced. Yes, their children are beginning to settle into schools across the rest of Israel. But really, why now?
I think some will say it's kind of internal political considerations. We saw the very same week that Netanyahu tried to replace the defense minister, not a great idea in the middle of a war, with another political figure that will allow him another 4 members of Knesset. So some said it relates to that. It might be related to the pressure to reach a ceasefire agreement with Gaza, because Hassan Nasrallah connected a ceasefire in Gaza with the end of their operations in the north.
This is the leader of Hezbollah.
Yeah. And if this happens, they will see that it's a missed opportunity to reduce Hezbollah's opportunities and actually sending a very clear message to Tehran.
Okay, we'll come back to exactly those questions of Israel's motives and indeed the chance of success. But Lina, you have many connections in Lebanon. What has been the effect of these strikes? And by strikes, I mean everything from exploding mobiles and pagers to the bombing that we've now seen begin.
Well, several things. At the level of civilians, of course, mass displacement from the south, quite a lot of concern by people in Beirut in particular, whether this will spread like what happened in 2006. Politically, it has further exposed how weak the Lebanese government is and how much of a lack of say it has in the matter. The Lebanese state is basically captured by Hezbollah, and Lebanese ministers just issue statements without being able to really tell Hezbollah to stop, because Hezbollah doesn't operate through authorization from the Lebanese government. So this has been underlined once again, in addition to also underlining the weakness of the Lebanese government in meeting the needs of the citizens who have fled.
So just if you could just tease that open a bit for us. If the Lebanese government had been stronger, what do you imagine it might have said to Hezbollah? Are you accepting some of the Israeli charge that what Hezbollah is doing ought to be controlled and stopped?
I mean, lots of Lebanese would say that what Hezbollah is doing needs to be stopped. In fact, the vast majority, I would say, did not want to see Lebanon involved in the Gaza conflict at all. Hezbollah, on the other hand, I think felt compelled on October 8 to enter this conflict mainly for the sake of survival, because it, from the very beginning, has been part of Iran's network of proxies in the Middle East. It uses the cause of Palestine as a legitimacy framework to argue that it should keep its weapons to defend Lebanon from Israel. And it is, in this context, an ally of Hamas. So it could not be seen in its eyes to be standing there doing nothing while its ally is conducting a huge war with Israel. It would have lost its self-declared credibility.
Do you think it even felt upstaged by Hamas?
No, I don't think so at all. I don't think so at all. It's just that it felt it had to do something, but not something too big that would attract a huge Israeli retaliation. And that's why from the very beginning, Hezbollah's actions against Israel have been relatively limited.
And just this question of on the ground, what has this Israeli attack done? You've had, obviously, the communications, the immediate day-to-day communications of Hezbollah enormously disrupted, but you've got this enormous number of people now on the move, or tens of thousands at least. What effect is that having?
I mean, if Israel thinks that an attack on Hezbollah that exposes Hezbollah as weak is going to lead people in Lebanon to rise up against Hezbollah, this is pure fantasy, simply because the Lebanese people are still too weak to even stand up to the political status quo in Lebanon at large. And Hezbollah is intimidating as an actor. It has claimed this power in Lebanon through fear, intimidation, and assassination of its opponents. So there's not going to be a public uprising what the attacks have done to Hezbollah is definitely hit morale to a large extent, because Hezbollah has been for decades prepared for a military assault by Israel, but not a security breach, not infiltration of its communications network to this extent, and certainly not an interception of its supply chain.
I mean, this was extraordinary. It was spectacular. But it was a triumph for Mossad, if we're assuming it was the Israeli intelligence services that did this, after their huge humiliation of October 7th.
Absolutely, and it really backed Hezbollah into a corner, because, as I said, Hezbollah was not expecting this kind of attack that hit security, that hit morale, that also was followed with more assassinations of its top commanders. And we've seen the reaction. What has Hezbollah's reaction, at least to date, been? Launch one mid-range missile on Tel Aviv that was, of course, intercepted by Israel. One missile. Time to launch at 6:29 in the morning, which was the timing when Hamas launched its assault on October 7 against Israel. So this is just messaging. So Hezbollah at the moment is in a much weaker position. This combination of basically hybrid warfare by Israel has really shown how much of an upper hand it has over Hezbollah.
Gregg, let's pick up again this question that Yossi began to take us into of why Israel has done this right now. What do you reckon the motives, plural, might be?
I think it is plural. The pager and walkie-talkie blasts, which of course began this whole sequence of events over the past 8 days, there are some people who will argue that Israel didn't dictate the timing there, that there were concerns within the Mossad, within the Israeli intelligence community, that Hezbollah might be close to discovering that these pagers were sabotaged and it might swap out the devices. And
just on this point, this is something that can we presume that Israel would have been planning this for a long time, probably before October 7th, because you're talking about getting into the supply chain of these devices?
I think for a very long time. I mean, for years prior to October 7th, Hezbollah was a much bigger priority for the Israeli army, the Israeli security services, than Hamas was. They thought Hamas in Gaza was contained, and they thought the threat from the northern border was much more significant. So to set up front companies abroad, to go through the process of infiltrating the supply chain and sabotaging thousands of devices, yes, I think that is something they would have started doing well before October 7th. And they may have been in a position last week where they felt they either had to use this capability or lose it. And that is part of why they decided to act now. So I think that's one factor. I think another more perhaps personal political factor for Prime Minister Netanyahu is just a desire to show that something is going well on one of these fronts. I mean, most Israelis, when you talk to them, when you look at polls, most Israelis do not think that they're winning the war in Gaza. They're not achieving either of their stated goals of vanquishing Hamas or securing the release of the 100 plus hostages who are still being held there, have been held for almost a year. There's a lot of pessimism about Gaza. And then there's also been, of course, growing criticism that these 60,000 people who've been displaced can't go back. And so for Netanyahu to shift focus to the northern front politically might serve his interests as well.
Yossi, what is your take on the possibility of success? You can define that absolutely as you like.
I think you can have a war that everyone is a loser, and that's what we are getting right now. Who is winning this war? No one. And I think to pick on Lina's point, that the idea that you go and bomb another country and the people that are bombed are going to become your friends, and they are going to rise against a much superior force, as you put it, Lina, is a pure fantasy. And Israel is trying that in every front. We bomb and kill 40,000 people in Gaza, and then they're supposed to be on your side. So the people of Gaza, they don't like Hamas, but they definitely don't like the people that bomb them. They don't like the occupation in the West Bank. They don't like the PA and the Fatah. They don't like Hezbollah.
That's the Palestinian Authority and Fatah, the rival to Hamas.
Yeah. So you get the point that there is not, because as long as they see it in a zero-sum game, in a binary way, they keep failing because they apply the wrong policies towards that. And in no case, and this goes all the way back to the war in Lebanon in 1982, in the first failed attempt to make friends by installing a leader there and think that Israel was going to survive. It lasted 5 minutes. So they are not winners here. And you see the protest in Israel, back to the point that Gregg made. There are hundreds of thousands of people in the streets. And they said, first and foremost, we want first to see the hostages come back. This will be a victory of sorts. And they are not impressed by the killing more Hamas leaders or Hezbollah leaders, because again, few weeks later, there are new leaders. Israel killed the founder of Hamas, Sheikh Yassin, and few weeks later, Rantisi, and it didn't stop Hamas.
Lina, what about the chances of success in what Israel says it is trying to do, of driving Hezbollah back those crucial kilometres from the border that will stop it being such a threat to the northern towns and allow the Israeli residents to go home?
Unlikely, because it's really, again, unrealistic to expect decoupling the situation in Lebanon from the situation in Gaza. Hezbollah has been very explicit about that. Let's not forget that Hezbollah and Israel fought for almost 2 decades during the time of Israel's occupation of southern Lebanon, and Hezbollah managed to withstand, Israeli action during that time, plus, of course, 2006 afterwards, etc. So this is a group that can operate for a very long time to act as a spoiler. And this is what Hezbollah actually defines as success at the moment. So Hezbollah is not claiming that it wants another decisive victory like 2006. What Hezbollah regards as successful is if it manages to keep northern Israel unsafe. And for it to do that doesn't require a lot of military action. And so again, Israel's at least declared objectives are too high to be realistic.
And just walk us down onto the West Bank, if you will, which Yossi mentioned very briefly, and what is happening there. I was at, as I said, the Labour Party conference, and this was beginning to rise up the agenda, including in a conversation I had with David Lammy, Foreign Secretary, and rising up the agenda is where I think many of us at Chatham House have argued it should be. Israel has been, in the months since October 7th, appropriating more land and so on. Do you see this as a third front of action by Israel?
One hopes it's not. I mean, I don't know what Yossi thinks about that one.
It is already a front. It's already a front, maybe on a lower level, but, we forget that since the 7 October, 700 plus Palestinians were killed, dozens of Israelis. There keep operations in the 10,000 people are arrested and detained, many of them without trial. So this is on the agenda. Obviously, we pay more attention to Gaza and to Lebanon because of the scale of the war, but it doesn't mean that on a lower scale there is no war there as well.
And we heard from several people, Yossi, that the IDF is not well placed to handle a long war, certainly not one on many fronts, because of the number of reservists there who have jobs and families and need to pay attention to both of those.
Israel always been, or when it was successful at wars, when it was short, the society united and there was international backing. And you look now, it doesn't exist. And when you talk to young people that spend already 8 months in reserve. So if you're a student, not much of an academic year. If you run a business, it probably will fail. There is an ongoing cost, economic cost, social, but also many people that come back, many young soldiers, and I spoke to a few of them, they come traumatized because what they do and what they see. And it's impossible when it's sustained like that for so many months. And they move between being in Gaza and then few months in the north. That affects society itself. It also affects the soldiers. It affects their families too. And I think the hostages, not putting enough effort to release the hostages, made it even worse for them and their motivation. Now, to be honest, so far they're motivated and they are ready to go. But here and there you hear of those who won't show up for military service.
And there are around 100 hostages still in Hamas's hands, although some of those, a third or more, are believed to be dead. Gregg, I wonder if you could take us into this wider question of success. Military success, making Israel safe, security, the word that is inescapable when you're in Israel, and also this question of international opinion. Is it possible for Israel to make itself secure but lose international opinion? What do you make of it?
I think both sides have put themselves in a position over the past year where they cannot achieve their stated objectives. Hezbollah going to battle on behalf of Hamas almost a year ago they have not been able to push Israel into a ceasefire in Gaza. They have tied up some Israeli military resources on the northern border. They have turned northern Israel into a depopulated wasteland, but they have not compelled Israel to end its fighting in Gaza. And they have found themselves in a position where they can't stop fighting because they are pursuing this unachievable goal, and they are very publicly yoked to this unachievable goal. And then I think now for Israel, it's a very similar risk. I mean, this idea that they can push Hezbollah into a unilateral ceasefire, that Nasrallah will agree to a truce with Israel independent of a truce between Israel and Gaza. I'm not sure that proposition is going to work. I'm not sure Nasrallah is going to go for it. And if he doesn't, then Israel finds itself continually escalating ever further. It will have to, I mean, some of the things that Israeli generals are talking about now, carrying out airstrikes on civilian infrastructure in Lebanon, the airport, for example, things like that were bombed early in the 2006 war, possible talk of a ground invasion. It starts to look like a quagmire for Israel with no way out. And it's one that I think will come at huge international cost. I mean, I think the debate around what Israel is doing in Lebanon is inescapably going to be colored by what Israel has done in Gaza over the past year, the way Israel has laid waste to Gaza. And I think to do anything similar in Lebanon now is going to do, yes, irreparable damage to its international standing.
What would you say to those Israelis, and there are quite a few of them, including at senior levels, who say security trumps international support for us every time?
I think look to history, particularly when it comes to talk of a ground invasion, when it comes to talk of setting up a buffer zone in Lebanon and these sorts of ideas. I mean, Israel has, as Yossi said, a very long and very unhappy history in Lebanon. And the reason Hezbollah exists in the first place is because it arose out of that Israeli occupation of South Lebanon. If you want people to feel safe going back to northern Israel, you are not going to achieve that, even through, I think, weeks of airstrikes that do significant damage to Hezbollah's rocket and missile arsenal. There are still going to be fears that there is this militant group across the border that has tens of thousands probably of remaining rockets and missiles, that has well-trained and battle-hardened ground forces. You can't eradicate that. When you speak to Israeli military officers in private, some of them do acknowledge that what they have spoken about in Gaza, this idea of trying to achieve the total defeat of Hamas, that is simply not possible with Hezbollah in Lebanon. Arguably, it's not possible with Hamas in Gaza either, but they're not even setting that as a goal in Lebanon. They recognize that it's impossible. You are not going to bomb your way into a situation where residents of the north really feel safe going back.
So let's move to our second question, more briefly than the first, but that is, what is going to happen in the region more widely? And Lina, maybe you could take us into this. How do you think Iran might respond?
Well, Iran, like Hezbollah, is concerned about self-preservation. It wants Iran itself to be out of this hot war. And so far it is achieving that, because if it wanted to escalate, Hezbollah then would have started using its heavy artillery. And it's not doing that because it does not want full-scale regional war. That's something that Iran is very definite about. What Iran wants...
Just on that, why doesn't it want that?
Oh, because that would then involve the US taking part, and Iran knows that even with all its proxies deployed, they will not be able to win that one. It would be a war of devastation for Iran and its project of influence across the Middle East. So what it's trying right now is to maintain a sense of credibility, to still say we are part of a self-styled axis of resistance, as Iran likes to call it, but with minimal damage to Iran itself. But it also doesn't want Hezbollah to be obliterated. And this is a key thing, because for Iran, Hezbollah is the most valuable asset it has for influence in the region. And if Hezbollah crumbles, then the Houthis in Yemen are likely to crumble. So there will be a domino effect across the region.
How would that happen?
Because the Houthis in particular look up to Hezbollah as a kind of big brother. Their ties with Hezbollah are closer than their ties with the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, for example. And so Hezbollah is not just about Hezbollah. Hezbollah is also about the domino effect that this will have in the region. And at the moment, when Hezbollah is rattled, like what happened with the communication devices attacks, this will cause all these other groups in the region to also start to sweat. They will be concerned about their own security breaches, their own kind of operations. And so this is the moment of concern for Iran right now, the moment of focusing on self-preservation. This is not the moment to deploy all its proxies to launch an all-out attack on Israel or spark any kind of region-wide full-scale war.
Gregg, we have just heard, as we're recording this, that Israeli defense officials are saying that a ground invasion is likely within the next couple of days. What do you make of that?
My immediate reaction to that is almost a bit of skepticism. We have not seen, I don't think we have seen in recent days the sorts of preparations that you would expect if there was a ground invasion coming in the next 2 days, not large-scale call-ups of reservists, not moving huge amounts of armored vehicles and other military equipment to the northern border. There has been some of that over the past week. There have been some troops sent there in what seemed like a defensive positioning. There has been some equipment sent, but not on a larger scale. So I think that's my first question, is if they are planning a ground invasion in the next 48 hours, with whom?
The chief of the general staff of the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, Herzi Halevi, has told troops that jets have been striking to prepare the ground for your possible entry and also to continue hitting Hezbollah. Yossi, what do you think?
First of all, it definitely took the sting out of a surprise attack if you tell in advance 48 hours.
Yeah, there's something, you've got exploding mobiles on the one hand and then you've got a warning. Do you feel this is positional?
It feels like this because why,
positional in the sense of performative.
In a way, you would expect actually a limited ground invasion, and I think to push Hezbollah to the Litani River. That's not going, 82 style all the way to Beirut, or even to go to the Shuf mountain, but to go all the way to the Litani River and try to establish some buffer zone. And now it sounds like a deja vu that, we've been there. But also what I think we heard, the idea of not to hold it, is just to try to enforce UN Resolution 1701 and try to see who will take it from there.
A lot of talk about, not quite surgical strikes, but in and out. But our faces probably said it all, because that does not always work in military terms.
You can plan to do that. It doesn't mean that is going to be translated on the ground, because it depends what you find when you get there. In a way, why I'm not surprised but what's said, because already early today, it was around the 2 brigades already been on the border, on the border with Lebanon. So there is some of preparation. It might be again positioning, see what we have done in the last week. We surprised you with the pager. Then we managed to get some of the leadership out. Then we keep bombing and getting out launchers. If you want before into a diplomatic negotiation over Resolution 171 or a new one, then we are resorting to ground invasion.
Gregg, this news, if it is news, interrupted what I was asking you, which is really whether we're heading for a wider war.
When you say a wider war, do we mean a wider war between Israel and Hezbollah, or do we mean a wider war in the region?
I mean in the region. Lina has already been arguing, look, Iran really doesn't want this, but we do have this escalating action in Lebanon.
No, I tend to agree with Lina on this. I mean, you look at what the Iranian president said at the UN this week. You look at what the Iranian foreign minister tweeted yesterday. He tweeted this, very lovely message about how Hezbollah is capable of defending itself. It can defend Lebanon on its own with its own capabilities, and that seemed like a way of saying, we're standing behind you, very, very far behind you. We don't want any part of this. We don't want to get involved. They've made it abundantly clear over the past year that they are not willing to go to war on behalf of their proxies. The whole reason those proxies exist is to keep war away from Iran. The one time that they have directly attacked Israel over the past year was when their own personnel were being killed in Israeli strikes, ending with that Israeli strike on the Iranian consular building in Damascus that prompted Iran to lash out and fire missiles and drones at Israel. But otherwise, I really don't think they have any appetite to join the battle directly, and especially at a time when they, like Hezbollah, like all of their other proxies across the region, are going to be very worried about whether they too have been penetrated by Mossad and what sorts of sabotage or other tricks the Israelis might have up their sleeves.
Do you think what Israel has done marks a bit of a split with the US? Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, has been straight on the front foot saying we really do not want an escalation.
It's been a bit remarkable to watch over the past few days. I mean, the Americans have spent months saying exactly that, saying they don't want an escalation in Lebanon, urging Israel not to go beyond the rules of engagement that have governed the conflict for almost a year now. And yet, over the past week, they seem to have done almost an about-face, and they're now supportive of these new Israeli tactics. John Feiner, the Deputy National Security Advisor, gave an interview to NPR yesterday, and he said, we view this as a way for Israel to secure the return of people to the northern border. He was fairly supportive of this Israeli belief that they can pressure Nasrallah into making a separate deal. They continue to insist that a ground invasion is a red line, that they do not want to see a ground invasion. Airstrikes are okay. This sort of aerial campaign is fine, but they don't want the Israelis to send ground troops. But then we've seen time and time again over the past year how porous and how flexible Joe Biden's red lines are when it comes to Israel.
I just want to make a point, because I agree with both Lina and Greg that no one has appetite for a regional war. But the history is replete with wars that no one wanted. And as we sat here in June 1914, and we had this podcast, and we talked about no one wanted appetite for a war in Europe, and look what happened. And no one will go for war with Russia in the winter, because it makes no sense. So I think we have to be careful. I think we were accused one of the meetings of being too rational. And when in a region that doesn't behave necessarily rationally. So I think we also should leave ourselves a margin of error that if everyone behaves rationally, there's not going to be a regional war, but who can guarantee that everyone will behave rationally?
That is absolutely right. I'm certainly not offering those guarantees. Lina, though, I might just ask you for a point of rationality at the end about Saudi Arabia, which is sitting there fairly quietly, but senior Saudis saying, including on Chatham House platforms, we really would like a deal with Israel. We would like to normalize relations, but obviously that must depend on a ceasefire in Gaza and land for the Palestinians. But we really would like it, and we're the great prize, and here could come relationships with much of the Arab world, and indeed Malaysia and Indonesia and so on. Do you think at this point that rational talk of that kind of diplomacy, that kind of way out, way forward, is really just wishful thinking, or does it have some play in this?
There is no other choice for Saudi Arabia, because if they want to see the region become stable, they have to convince, I guess, the West, because the problem is not with Saudi Arabia. The problem is the West, mainly Washington. They have to convince them somehow that they need to sort out two things. One is resolve the Palestine-Israel conflict, and two, do something about Iran's regional interventions in the Middle East. The thing is, it's not up to the Saudis to really convince anyone, because it's Washington that basically needs to have the political will to really engage in diplomacy on those two fronts. And these two fronts are now more intertwined than ever before. And so if we're going to apply rational thinking, the rational thinking would mean prioritizing a solution, not just to the Gaza conflict, but to the Israel-Palestine conflict, because then Hezbollah would have no excuse to even exist as an armed actor the way it does now. Iran will not say this is all on the path to liberating Jerusalem. All this falls apart if that conflict is resolved.
And let me just tease out one final point from the three of you, whether you think that any part of Israel's motives is trying to do something about Iran's nuclear program, Iran having taken itself almost to the brink of having a nuclear weapon, though not quite there.
I don't think this has anything to do with Iran's nuclear program. I think Iran is, in fact, activating now this discussion about its nuclear program as part of the package to say, we don't want to be involved, leave us alone, we can be actually a good player, and let's keep these two issues in a way separate.
I agree. I think that Iran is not interested in a regional war. And I think it's actually an opportunity, depends also who is elected in the US election, to restart some sort of negotiations over the nuclear, but it's not part of what's happening now.
Gregg.
I wish I could disagree for the sake of argument, but no, I agree with Yossi and Lina. I think when you speak to Israeli officials now, some of them acknowledge that Iran's nuclear program is almost too far gone for them to do anything militarily about. And it's quite remarkable how Netanyahu, who has spent so many years talking about Iran's nuclear program and making that out to be the chief threat in the region, is not saying anything about it anymore.
On that point of complete agreement and high point of rationality, I think we're going to have to bring it to a close. We are, as I said, going to revisit the subject of the region next week and talk about the anniversary of the October 7th attacks and look in more detail at Israel and Palestine on this wider question and on the impact in Lebanon itself. We've tried to do that justice today. Huge thank you to my guests, Lina Khatib, Gregg Carlstrom and Yossi Mekelberg. Please follow them all on X. You can find their details in the show notes. Please do look to chathamhouse.org for our wide coverage of this subject from many of our writers. They don't all agree. They are all rational to some degree. And they really come from a huge variety of experience on this and really bringing their best thoughts and work to it. Please do follow us as well through our social media and like, follow, subscribe, leave reviews. So with extremely busy weeks ahead internationally and at home where the party conferences are still going on, it's goodbye from me, Bronwen Maddox. See you next week.